All right, so let's get started. So welcome everyone to this general adversarial collaboration workshop that we are organizing from CCN. So this is kind of an alternative that we thought this year would be fun to do, and also having this situation that we all have to meet online. So we try to see in which ways we could engage more the community. So here you can see the program committee of this year CCN. So the chair is Nico Krigeskorte, co-chair Gunnar Blom, Megan Peters, Ralph Hafner, Eric DeWitt, and Jennifer Lieberman, and I am Gemma Roch. So I want to especially mention Megan because she was one of the main drivers of this whole GAC idea, and the initial idea was also coming from her. So what is the GAC and why are we organizing this? So we all know that science benefits from alternative ideas and theories, but what happens is that a lot of times we are just in our labs or at home doing our own research isolated from the others and trying to prove our theory. But here is where we thought that GAC could come into play. So these generative adversarial collaborations. So researchers with alternative theories could collaborate to resolve differences in a friendly environment and very collaborative. So how could we do that? So together with all the community and people working on similar questions, design the best possible fair way to disambiguate these theories. So again, in a collaborative way and engaging as many people as possible. And why do we think this is a good idea? And I think, and I hope you all agree with that. It's because it's a healthy, friendly, and collaborative competition. We think that it really accelerates scientific progress rather than just working in isolation. So how can the CCN community benefit from GACs? So it's an open public debate, and we think that this is especially important and a very good learning opportunity for early career researchers because they can engage in these discussions with researchers from different point of views of same questions. And of course, engaging the community, we can work out the differences together and in a friendly way. And the more people engage, the better. And we all know that with the diversity and more people, different ideas from different point of views are increasing. And science should also ask important questions. And this GAC platform provides a democratic way to decide what's important, and not only for a few people to decide which are the questions that we should be asking and doing research on. So we try to do this in an organized and collaborative way to answer those important questions that are decided by the whole community. And finally, but also very importantly, we want this to be a very transparent process. And for this, we had used this open review platform in which everything was open and people could comment on which GACs they thought they were more important, and also comment on the weaknesses and strong points of each of them. And this is the GAC Kickoff. So it's the first year that we are doing this. And after these workshops, we want to move forward with position paper with avenues forward and outcomes. And we also want to get everyone engaged in this process. So we have already had several GACs this year, so 5 of them. And now we are doing the last one of this workshop's kickoff of the GACs, which is do grid codes for generalization and flexible decision making, which I'm sure it will be very exciting and engaging for everyone. So without going into more details, I would like to pass this to the organizers of this GAC, and let's have fun and participate and get involved. So please use the chat for general discussion and also the Q&A panel if you have specific questions that you can also comment or answer in threads, and you can upvote so the organizers see it and can give priority to these questions that everybody thinks are more important. So yes, I'll now stop sharing my screen, and I invite the first speaker to share her screen. Yes. Linda, I think you are muted.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect.
So
all right. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be organizing this workshop on grid codes. I'm a postdoc at Brown University, and I'm organizing this workshop with Matt Nasser and our collaborators, Xiaomin Park, Sarah Swigert, and Ari Borman at UC Davis. And yeah, I'm very excited to talk about whether grid codes afford generalization and flexible decision-making. So what we're hoping to do for this workshop is to discuss what are grid codes, what they're useful for, and how we can test these theories. And we would love to get feedback on our proposed experiments and predictions and your thoughts about grid codes in general. So please feel free to comment in the Q&A box and also email us after the workshop with any further thoughts. And if you are really interested, you're very welcome to join our collaboration or write a company commentary piece to our position paper for 2021. So the schedule for this workshop, we're going to first start with a presentation of the topic and our proposed experiments with me, Xiaomin, and Sarah. And then we will launch into our theoretical session where we will hear from Ann Collins and Andrea Benino, where they'll talk about some of the background and theoretical underpinnings of generalization and grid codes, and followed by a panel discussion with these speakers. And then we will launch into our experimental session where we'll hear from Miriam Kleinfluge and Matthias Vandermeer, where they'll talk about animal models and some of their exciting work on the neural mechanisms of grid codes, followed by a panel discussion as well. And then we will wrap up. So let's get into it. So first, I'll just present very briefly on some background on what grid cells are. So grid cells are found in this seminal paper from Hafting et al. And the Mosers, where they recorded from the medial and terminal cortex of the rat, shown here in this red dot here. Well, they had the rats freely roaming around a circular arena. And what you can see here on the right is the peak firing rates of these cells, which formed, when you take the autocorrellogram, to form this tessellating hexagonal pattern over the arena. And it looks like a grid overlaying the arena, and that's why they're called grid cells. And similar cells have been found in the human entorhinal cortex in intracortical recordings, as well as a few other areas in the cortex, like medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate. Subsequently, Dola et al. Pioneered a method in looking at their aggregate activity through both signals in fMRI, while they had participants roaming around a virtual reality arena while they're lying in the scanner. And they found medial prefrontal cortex and entorhinal cortical activity that corresponded to this grid-like modulation. Subsequently, the similar sort of code has been found to represent a conceptual space represented by the neck and leg length of these bird-like stimuli, as well as sound frequency in rodents, gaze direction, and odor type intensity in human fMRI. So what we would like to explore in this GAC is to sort of think more about whether grid-like codes can enable generalization to new contexts and stimuli, and what are the constraints or conditions under which grid-like codes would and would not appear. So there's been a lot of discussion about whether the grid codes can constitute a domain general mechanism. So in this really cool theoretical paper, basically Bauman et al. Proposed that the grid-like code can underlie basically conceptual space. So in here, they have an example of a 2D attribute space where they have one dimension, which is the passenger capacity of cars, and the other dimension is the weight of the cars. And then you can just array all of your exemplars of various types of cars within this conceptual space. And then so when you're trying to think about or making a decision between one car to another, what you might be doing is to essentially traveling like you would in physical space, but this time in conceptual space, between these two car exemplars. And so this got me really interested in whether this kind of mechanism would underlie value-based decision-making, which was my focus in graduate school. So I decided to test this theory in a intertemporal choice paradigm where you're making a decision between an immediate option, $20 today, and various delayed option, for example, $35 in 30 days. As you can see, this can also be thought of as a 2D attribute space where one of the dimensions is the amount of the money and the other dimension is the delay. And so when you're making a decision, perhaps you're traveling between 2 points on this plane. And the reason why we were really interested in this question is because subjective value has been a really robust neurocorrelate to neuroactivity in this paradigm, particularly in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which is also a region of the brain where a lot of these fMRI studies on grid code navigation has found. So it's possible that the effects of subjective value that we see in this intertemporal choice paradigm could be a product of navigation between 2 points in this 2D attribute space. So that's what we wanted to test. And so this is the attribute space or the cognitive space in our task. So one dimension is amount, the other is delay. And all the dots you see here are the questions we asked our participants. And this is a pre-existing data set of people that we just scanned who simply did this task. And the choice they had to make was a choice between $20 immediately and some delayed amount, for example, $42 in 48 days. And what we're assuming under this model is that what they're doing when they're making their choice is traveling between these 2 points. So you can calculate a trajectory angle like you would in physical space between those 2 points. And you can do so for all the questions that we asked the participants. And I won't go too much into detail here, but this is just to show that the subjective value code in this task and the grid code are actually very highly correlated. So whether you have a participant who's patient or inpatient, across a range of discount values, you have a high correlation between the subjective value model and the corresponding grid-like code model. So it ranges from like a correlation of 0.5 to up to 0.7. So this is just to say that it is actually theoretically possible that the signal that we see in past task of intertemporal choice and other value-based tasks could be some form of this grid code. So that's why we had to test this empirically. And long story short, to our surprise, what we actually found is that neither the two ROIs we looked at, the medial prefrontal cortex nor the entorhinal cortex, showed consistent grid-like code between the sessions. So you can see that you have the subjective value regressors are the ones that best explain the model consistently across sessions of data, and not the grid-like model, which is the six-fold hexagonal modulation, six-fold model that's highlighted in red here. So that's not the best explanation for the data in neither the medial prefrontal cortex nor the entorhinal cortex. So why do we not see a grid code in this task? Well, first, everyone, the obvious thing to point out is that this is not a task that was meant to look for the grid code. It was simply a decision-making task that our participants did. And that's sort of the point, because we were trying to see whether this analysis would work in just really any normal situation when you're making a simple decision. So I think that our results show the limits of the grid code, even in representing the kind of two-dimensional attribute space, much like the conceptual spaces in the previous studies I showed you that use fMRI to look at grid-like codes, and where the past value signals plausibly could have been explained by a grid code because they were so highly correlated. And so some of the reasons why we might not see a grid code in this task could include, one possibility is that the subjective value might be the most efficient representation for the task and not the grid code. And the other possibility is that this paradigm that we looked at necessitated only travel between a fixed immediate option versus delayed options. So if you remember this attribute states I showed you earlier, you're always traveling between one fixed point to these other points, never between the points themselves. And that might be an issue for reasons I will outline in just a second in this next section. So what we were really interested in for this GAC is whether grid codes can underline generalization. But what do we mean when we say generalization? There's actually two main things that people sort of talk about when they talk about generalization. One is the transfer of learned structure from one context to another. So applying something relationships you've already learned in one context and using it to learn, learn new things in a new context. And the other one is the inference of novel associations, such as shortcuts. So if you're traveling between A to B and B to C, you can maybe infer the shortcut of between A and C, even if you've never experienced before. So we'll talk about both of these aspects of generalization, and I'll focus just on this first one for now. So I like to illustrate this example, this transfer of structure with an example. So imagine that this is your favorite grocery store, Trader Joe's, and you are very familiar with the setup. You know that when you walk in, you have the produce section out like by the entrance and the seafood section besides that, and the meat and the eggs are in the back. But then one day you because of the pandemic, the lines are super long outside Trader Joe's, and you have to go into Whole Foods that you've never been before. And how are you supposed to find things in this new grocery store? Well, you're not really learning from scratch when you go into a new grocery store, because the same structure that you find in the Trader Joe's actually also pretty much applies to the Whole Foods, and in fact to basically all grocery stores. So as you can see, just as in the Whole Foods, the produce aisle is by the entrance, the seafood is next to that, and the meat and the eggs are at the back of the store. So you can simply transfer your knowledge of grocery stores that you've experienced in the past into this new grocery store. So when you want to look for a jug of milk, for example, you don't need to search from scratch. You can simply go straight to the place where the structure of the store layout indicates. And the way that we think the grid code plays into a transfer structure is that one conception of it is that it actually consists of the successor representation. So what's the successor representation? It's a matrix of discounted future expected occupancies. So what this really means is just that it's a cache trajectory of your past experiences. So let's say you have this rat on a linear track, and the rat is traveling from state 1 to state 2, state 3, and then all the way to the goal. If you look at a single place field, single place field or the successor representation, you'll see that it basically stretches all the way back to the beginning, meaning that it shares credit with all the states that predicted it. So this is a great way of fast credit assignment. And the idea behind grid cells, one sort of conception of it as outlined from the Stackenfeld paper, is that grid cells is a eigenvector or a principal component of the successor representation. So it's a low dimensional projection of the successor representation. And why do we think this will be useful for transferring across contexts is due to another very neat feature of grid cells, where, so in this paper, they recorded rats, and if you look at the firing field for these individual grid cells in context A versus context B, you'll notice in the left-hand column, there's like no correlation between the firing field of these two contexts. But then if you go to the context B, and you start rotating context B, rotating it about 60 to 70 degrees in this case, you'll notice that now the correlation between A and B are actually quite high. And this means that basically your firing field, your grid-like code, your code for B is actually just a rotation of A. And you can see across these 3 grid cells, it takes about the same amount of rotation, the same amount of degrees. So it's consistent across grid cells. So this is all to say that we think that the grid code could be a low dimensional efficient representation that enables transfer. So you can just take your firing field and the relationships you've already learned for one context and simply transfer it to another context. What are the implications of this hypothesis? Well, the thing about successive representations is that it can't go where you've never been. It can't infer experiences that you've never had. So or trajectories you've never had. So if you have a wall blocking the agent's path, then the successive representation only stretches to the part of the area the agent can access and not beyond it. And this might help to explain why we don't see a grid-like code in this intertemporal choice task I just told you about, because we only have the participants think about the relationship between $20 now and a delayed option. They can't infer, where they've never experienced the transition between any of the delayed amounts. Even if they're neighboring, one cannot predict the other because they are not, the transition is never experienced. And this is what we want to test in the experiment that we're proposing for this collaboration. So there are 3 main questions we wanted to address. One is, does the grid code allow for rapid transfer of structure from one context to another? Can the grid code represent a cognitive space that's independent of the physical correlates learned over so that it can be abstracted over the physical space? And is the grid code a form of the successive representation, which means that it won't exist where there is no previous experience? So this is our experiment. We have 3 sessions. One is the training, and the other 2 are different forms of generalization tests. So the task looks like this. The participant navigates a purple shield, or sorry, a shield of a certain color, in this case purple, across this planet, and they're told they have to block alien attacks, and the color is predictive of where the aliens will attack. So when they navigate, they'll navigate their shield to a place they think the aliens are going to attack. They'll see a feedback in terms of the bomb landing where the aliens have attacked, and now they know that the next time they see this purple shield, they should navigate to this area, and there's noise surrounding the outcome. And next time, so then they see a green shield and they navigate to another place where they think the alien will attack. And this time they are correct. So they'll know that for green, they should be navigating to this area. And so each of the 5 colors are associated with 5 areas on this planet. So the participants learned this for a while. And then they experience a transition where all the colors have now shifted to new locations. But they actually shifted consistently in that all the locations are just a 90-degree transformation of the previous map. So if the participants, we don't tell the participants this, they have to figure it out. But if they do successfully figure it out, then all they have to do is rotate their map 90 degrees for when they are switching between the 2 maps of the task. In the second session, we scan the participants, but we also throw in a generalization test. This is generalization to a novel stimulus. So now they see the original 5 colors, but they also see a new color, cyan, in this example. And the first time they see cyan, obviously you would expect their error to be quite high because they don't know where it's going to be, and that error will decrease for subsequent trials. But that's only for the first rotation that they see the color in. Now, when everything shifts 90 degrees, what we expect for the first trial in which they see the cyan color again is that they'll actually have a much more decreased error for that trial because they were able to transfer the structure they've learned in the previous context to this new one and generalize it to this new stimulus. And we call that zero-shot learning. And the third session, we have another generalization test, not for novel rotations. So once again, they see the colors in their original positions, But then after a while, they start to shift not 90 degrees, but some arbitrary amount of degrees. So for example, 30 degrees or 90 degrees, or 60 degrees or 180 degrees or whatever. And so they have no way to knowing how many degrees that is until they see this very first color appear in that new rotation. And obviously you expect the error for that to be quite high because they have no idea where it's going to be. But then as they see more and more colors appear in that particular rotation, by the time they get to this fifth color, this purple color, we would expect the error for that to be quite low because they will have transferred this color relationship to that color and therefore exhibit again zero-shot learning. So the neural predictions for this task is that we will see two different kinds, or we might see one of the two or both types of representations of this task. So here what I'm showing you is the expected bold activity, which is the 6-fold sinusoidal activity that we would expect if a grid code is present, because it's modulated by 60 degrees. And here, what you would expect when you travel in a particular direction on this physical space, let's say this angle denoted by theta here, you would fall on a particular part of the curve, the sinusoidal curve that I'm showing you here. And this would be initially the same for both the cognitive representation and the spatial representation of the task. But when everything shifts 90 degrees, what we now expect is a dissociation between the cognitive and the spatial representation of the task. So let's say, once again, you travel in that same direction in physical space, it's going to land on the theta, it's going to land on the same part of the physical curve, the red dotted line, but it's going to land on a completely different part of the cognitive curve. And the cognitive curve represents the relationship between the colors, and that will have shifted 90 degrees because along with the color space. So we expect to see this dissociation occur, that maybe one brain area would maybe internal cortex would only represent the cognitive space, or maybe different parts of the areas would represent different parts of this, different representations. And then finally, we just have a control experiment to test this successor representation idea. So this training experiment is going to be on a different set of participants. It'll be exactly the same, except for this training session. And the training session, the difference is that the colored shield will always start from the center. So in the previous experiments, it started anywhere on the screen or on the planet. But in this case, it always starts from the center. And what this will create is the same sort of fixed transition relationship from the starting point to a particular point that we had in the intertemporal choice task, so that participants will only experience fixed transitions and they won't be able to experience a complete set of transitions. And what we would predict for this kind of experiment, for the control experiment, is that the zero-shot inference would either be abolished entirely in some participants or reduced. Inference by other mechanisms, more deliberative mechanisms, is certainly possible, but it's going to be more effortful. So our bet is that much fewer participants will be able to do it if they're able to do it. And we'll also predict that the grid-like code will be abolished, because if the grid-like code is in fact a form of successor representation. And so that's it for me. With that, I'll hand things over to Xiumin, and he'll continue.
Hi, everybody. Yes, can I control it? Okay, good. So yes, thanks, Linda. I think Linda was explaining about the generalization about the transfer learning, but now I'm trying to share toward another aspect of the generalization, which is structural inferences and the flexible decision making. The idea of the cognitive map helps us to understand how the brain offers generalization and flexible decisions. So the term of cognitive map was originally coined by Edward Tolman in the 1940s to explain the behavior of the rat that could not be explained by simple reinforcement learning rules. In one of his experiments in here showed that after rat learning to find the reward in a route-guided maze, as shown in the left side, the maze, rat were able to choose the direct route to the goal when the maze is suddenly changed to the noble sunburst configuration as in right. So this finding suggests that the animal construct the mental representation of environment and use this cognitive map to generalize their previous experiences in a novel situation. The cognitive map is not limited only to navigating physical space. Tolman also proposed that we may use the same system to navigate the relationship between the abstract conceptual space in a similar manner to the spatial locations. For example, by understanding the structure of the family tree, we can infer the novel relationship. And also using the structural knowledge about the seasons, we can infer the season of the other hemisphere. And also recent finding also suggests that the hippocampus and entorhinal system construct a map of the abstract relationship in the multidimensional social hierarchy. So an imaging evidence suggests that the hippocampus, entorhinal cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex may play a key role in the learning and abstraction and representing the explicit structural knowledge. More importantly, the explicit representation of cognitive map afford rapid novel inferences beyond the experiences with a relatively low computational cost. However, little is known about how a brain uses explicit structural knowledge to make novel inferences. So in our lab, we hypothesized that the hexadirectional grid-like code, which helps animals to find the novel shortcut in a maze, so may also serve for everyday decision making between discrete options. So therefore, we try to address the following questions. So first, do the brain use the grid-like code to guide the novel inferences beyond experiences? And second, does the human brain use a grid-like code to compute the value for discrete decision options? So to answer the question, we perform following experiments. Before the fMRI scanning, we asked the human participant to learn the social hierarchy of the 16 individual in the two independent dimensions called the competence and the popularity during multiple days of the behavior training. So participants never saw the graph structure that you can see in the right side of the social hierarchy structure, but instead, participants could infer the social hierarchy transitively by comparing the relative status of the neighboring individuals who have one length differences in the given dimension through the feedback-based learning. So importantly, participants learn the hierarchy of each dimension on different day. For example, participants only learn the length of the competence dimension in day 1 and learn the length of the popularity dimension in day 2. So it allows us to making that during training, participants never experience the transition along the diagonal axis, or they never been asked to combine the length in the 2 dimensions. So in the fMRI, participants who successfully learned the social hierarchy actually continued the fMRI experiment called the partner selection task. So during each trial of the partner selection, participants sequentially saw the 3 phases of individuals. And the goal of the partner selection task is to making decision for the F0 individual to find a better business partner between the F1 and F2. To be accurate in the partner selection decision, participants need to compute the gross potential of each collaboration, which indicate how much benefit each pair can expect from their collaboration. So participants were instructed to compute the gross potential from the higher ranked individual in each pair of the competence and the popularity dimension. For example, in this current example, F0, who is at the medium level of the competence and the low level of the popularity, is better to collaborate with someone like F1 who can compensate for her weakness than the collaboration with F2. So as you may notice, the gross potential of each collaboration corresponding to the size of the rectangle drawn by the position of the 2 individuals. So to prevent further learning, we didn't give any feedback during the partner selection task. And also, we further investigated whether the human brain employed hexadirectional grid-like code to compute the gross potential each pairs. So before we see the result of the fMRI, after finishing the fMRI, we asked the participant to drag and drop the faces of the 16 individual in the places according to their hierarchy in the 2-dimensional space outside of the scanner. Note that our other behavior and all the imaging data was collected before this placement task. So it means that participants never had explicitly asked to think about the relationship between individuals in spatially before this placement task. So each dot in here actually represent the location, the participant, the place of the 16 individual, and we found that all participants correctly placed the faces. So this allows us to ensure that participants were able to construct the map according to the hierarchy. Yes, okay. So importantly, there is no priori reason to participant to build a cognitive map on 2D. Instead, participant can make a decision and by alternating the 1D representation per dimension. So however, if participants are still able to construct the 2D representation, then we expect to find the grid-like code when they making the value-based decision making. Yeah, so we identify the brain area in which its activity shows hexadirectional grid-like code, and we model the brain activity at the time of F1 and F2 presentation, because this is the kind of the time that they are evaluating the growth potential of each pair. So this analysis allows us to find the brain area in which its activities increases when the direction of the inferred trajectory is aligned to the internal grid orientation. And eventually this brain area is supposed to show the Higgs sixfold symmetry. So we found the brain area showing the hexadirectional grid-like code, including the internal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. So to visualize the sixfold, the symmetry effect in this brain area, we compute the mean activity of this area according to the direction of inferred trajectory within 30-degree bins. So this bar up in there is actually show that the mean brain activity in internal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, and they show that brain activities increases in the green bar where the inferred trajectory is aligned to the internal grid orientation, and decreases in the gray bar where the trajectory is misaligned to the internal grid orientation. So here we show that the hippocampal internal system actually integrate the independently learned discrete relationship in abstract dimension into a single cognitive map on a 2D Euclidean space, even without any continuous sensory feedback. And our finding provide that the grid-like code offer the structural inferences of novel relationship and integrate the multidimensional information from cognitive map to construct the decision values for decisions that they never made before. So after me, then Sarah will present the next experiment idea that we propose to examine how our brain offer the generalization and the flexible decision making in the task where the goal is changing.
Okay, so I'm going to start off by talking about a problem that we all face every day, which is this idea of how do we decide what we want to eat. And one way we could do this is by basically just organizing all of our food on sort of this unhealthiness, healthiness axis. But I think we can all agree that like the healthiness is not the only thing we care about when we're eating. We actually also care about enjoying the food that we eat. And so in that sense, we can basically generate this two-dimensional space that's characterized by this healthiness axis and this unhealthy and this enjoyableness axis. And we can use this space to help us make dynamic decisions. In the case of like, if I'm trying to decide what I want to be eating every day, I know that I need to weight this healthiness axis, but I also want food that I'm going to enjoy. And so therefore, I know that I want to kind of eat foods that are in this purple area that are maximizing both of these things. However, if, say, for example, I'm having a party, I might not care about this healthiness axis at all. I only want to make sure that I have like the best food that people are going to enjoy. And so even though these foods locations haven't changed in this space, I've been able to dynamically use these axes to make a decision and get to a different result. Additionally, in this space, if I want to compare two foods, if, for example, I'm comparing Brussels sprouts and pizza, I can think about their distance across this space, which is the Euclidean distance. And in the future, I'm going to refer to this as being task invariant. So the idea here is that it doesn't matter whether or not I care about healthiness or enjoyableness on this space, the distance between these two items in Euclidean distance is consistent. However, there's also these rank differences, which is the axis-relevant distance measures, which, yeah, I'll refer to as rank distance, and then later we'll talk about it in the context of being task invariant. So like, for example, when I was talking about foods that I wanted to eat, sometimes I wanted one of these axes, sometimes I didn't. And so this brings us to my big question, which is how does the brain represent and flexibly use cognitive maps? And so the space that I'm going to have my participants learn is this wine space. So not food space, but instead beverage wine space, where there's an axis that represents the body of the wine. So that's a full to light axis, and an axis that represents the taste of the wine from dry to sweet. And so every single wine bottle's location gives you information on how it scores on these two axes. And dry and sweet are total opposites of each other. You can't be high in both sweet and dry at the same time. So for our training, participants go through a pretty extensive learning and testing blocks. So in the case of learning, participants see two wine bottles and they have to say which one is relatively more of that context, in this case, dry. And then in testing blocks, they have a very similar structure, except they don't receive feedback. But a key part here is that during learning, one wine bottle would only be compared to wines that are exactly one row above or one row below. So these are the trials that they're receiving feedback for, but they'll only know it in this sort of pairwise one level difference comparisons. However, during testing, the comparisons could be one or more level difference. And so in order to do well in the testing blocks, you have to be able to basically infer the relationship of the wines that are far away, because you've never received feedback and you're not technically like learning that during the testing blocks. So on day one, participants did these learning and testing blocks in the context of one dimension. And then on day two, they learned it in the context of the other dimension. So when it comes to the actual fMRI experiment, we have this same space that I've been talking about, this wine space. And the cover story is that they've been hired to be a wine distributor or a wine sommelier, and they actually need to decide which wine should be sold in a given market, where every country seems to have a preference. But additionally, we actually also add these other countries, which equally weight two different dimensions. Participants never see this space. We're never tell them it's a 4x4. They have to infer it just from this learning. And we've never explicitly told them to combine those two dimensions either. However, in order to do well in this task, they need to be able to leverage that information. So for an example, on a trial, you'll see a country and what their preferences are. You see two wine bottles and you basically have to make a decision. But importantly, the participants do not receive any feedback. So in order to do well, they actually have to be constructing it. They're not learning theoretically within the fMRI task. And so the Euclidean distance across this wine space doesn't change. However, the rank distance does change depending on the context. So for example, if we're talking about Germany, which cares about the sweetness of this wine, and these countries are counterbalanced, this is just an example. But for example, all the wines in the top row are equal value. So Germany equally weights these, and you end up with 4 different ranks. However, in the case of Austria, which has this sort of combined axes and this diagonal of value axes, all the wines that are kind of run perpendicular diagonals are equally valued, and Austria prefers them the same. And you actually end up with 7 different ranks. And importantly here, if you compare the same 2 wines in the context of Germany and Austria, in Germany, these are relatively similar wines. They're only 1 rank level difference. However, in the case of Austria, these wines are actually much further apart. Ooh. And so this brings us to our 2 different hypotheses. One is that task representations are invariant and independent of the current task demands, and therefore the relationship should be explained by pairwise Euclidean distance. But then an alternative hypothesis would be that the task representations are instead variant, and they do change depending on the current tasks, in this case, the kind of country and their preferences, and therefore the relationship should be explained by this rank distance instead. And so we're going to look at this in the brain using representational similarity analysis, but just very briefly, in order to do this, we look at a pattern of activation in specific brain regions when participants are looking at different bottles of wine. And these patterns of activation will vary between the wines, but we actually expect some of them to be relatively more similar to each other than others. And the theory here is that that should theoretically represent sort of distance measures in conceptual cognitive map space. So some wines being relatively closer and some being relatively further. Our hypotheses make 2 different predictions about what explains this distance measure. Is this going to be a Euclidean distance, or is this going to be a rank distance? And so for an example of this, this is a representational similarity matrix, which basically illustrates Euclidean distance. And so just to basically say how to read this, if you were to compare 2 wines, in this case, there we go. In this case, wines 5 and 6 in Euclidean distance, which is represented here, you simply go to column 16, row 5, and this shows you the Euclidean distance prediction for this comparison. And so because these lines are relatively far apart in Euclidean distance, this means that they're relatively dissimilar, which is why it's this dark red. And so in this sense, this is basically what the Euclidean distance is predicting the type of relationship should be for the representations. And so for hypothesis 1, this is once again that these task relationships are invariant and the relationship should be explained by this Euclidean distance. And then hypothesis 2 is that task representations are variant and therefore are explained by rank distances. And so what we're going to do is we'll take participants' data and we'll create the sort of matrix based on the participants' representational similarity and then compare it to these to see if they'll be able to dissociate the type of representations the participants have for these lines. And additionally, we're also going to look at the grid code to determine if grid codes are affected by changes in representations as well. Okay. And then, all right, so that's, I'll hand back over control. Linda.
All right, do we have questions? Maybe I should stop sharing. No?
Do we have a time to answer the question, or do we use the time for the panel discussion or wrap up for the answer the question? I think we don't have a time.
Yeah. These seem like very detailed questions, so maybe we can do it as part of the panel discussion.
Or the wrap up, sorry for the delay, but we liked your question and we really want to answer that. So just hang in there. Thanks.
We will get to your questions. All right, so, oh yeah, so just to share my screen again. Wait, where did it go? Sorry about that. So now we're going to go into our theoretical session. Sorry, I think I've like closed my window for some reason.
Yeah, so just the one thing to remind everybody. So there is the theoretical session and the experiment session, and after each talk, we will have the 5 minutes to answer the clarification questions. But if you have a more general question, or if you want to discuss something about the bigger question, please hold it, and we'll discuss this one during the panel discussion. But you can just type anytime in the Q&A session. And maybe Linda can introduce our speakers.
Yes, okay, sorry. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce Ann Collins to kick off our theoretical session. So Ann is an assistant professor in psychology at UC Berkeley, and she did her postdoc with Michael Frank at Brown University and her PhD with Etienne Coquelin in cognitive neuroscience at Pierre and Marie Curie University. And she has done some of the most detailed work in terms of experimental work and modeling related to how people generalize. So I'm very excited to hear her talk. All right. Thanks, Ann.
Thanks for the introduction. And can you see my slides well?
Yes.
Okay, it's all good. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to the feedback. So I should clarify that I was invited to be the troublemaker a little bit. So to talk about generalization outside of the context of grid cells. And so I'm not going to talk about grid cells at all, but try to talk about generalization and flexible decision making in a slightly different theoretical context. And I'd be curious to hear if you think it could be reconciled or not. Okay, and I know I'm in the theoretical session too, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about experimental results that motivate the theoretical findings. Okay, so let's take a little bit of an example, and we've had lots of two-dimensional maps, so I'm going to have one too, and I'm going to consider this computer here. And we all, over the time, learn how to use a computer. And that's something that we can generalize really well, right? We can take another computer and we're going to maybe not do zero-shot learning, but very few-shot learning to adapt to a completely new computer, or maybe to this one. Okay, and over the course of your life, you've probably interacted with many, many different computers in the end. And when we think about generalization, and as we've seen in the previous talks, we often think about it in terms of the attributes of the items we consider. So for example, in this case, you might have one dimension here that's that's a very salient perceptual dimension. That's whether the computer is a desktop computer or whether it's a laptop computer. Okay, but there are maybe other features you could consider. So maybe, you know, you might care that a computer is in the left side of your room or in the right side of your room because it might be connected to the network in slightly different ways, or it might, you know, get light and get warm faster or something like that. Okay, so maybe a different attribute you might want to consider is this second dimension. And we could think again about this in a spatial way, the way the previous talks have thought about. Okay, but what my talk is going to make a point about is that maybe we don't care so much about those attributes of the computers for themselves. Maybe we care more about the way we interact with these computers, and we care more about that for trying to generalize our behavior. And in that sense, we might want instead to regroup those computers this way, because those ones have 3 different operating systems. This one is a Linux computer, those are Mac computers, and those ones are Windows computers. And maybe that's what matters more when you're trying to do decision making, to group things based on not directly observable features, but rather features of how you interact with your environment. Okay, so the questions I'll ask today is, how do we generalize not features of our environment, you know, the states that we look at when we see our environment, but rather the way we interact with them. Okay, so it's fairly different from generalizing our knowledge of the world, because we need to take into account not the features of what we perceive, even if they're more abstract features, but rather the features of the nature of our interactions with what we perceive. Okay, so in this talk, I'll talk to you, I'll have 2 parts. One showing you how we can use hierarchical reinforcement learning to try to generalize simple rules. In the second part, I'll try to extend this to more complex types of behaviors that have sequential dependencies between trials, called options. Okay, so I'd first like to talk about generalizing rules with hierarchical reinforcement learning. And I'll go back to my computer example, where, again, we care about our interactions with our environment, right? So you might be in a Linux operating system and try to fix your MATLAB having crashed problem or something like that. And you might take this action here. You might go to a command line and type a magic incantation, or you might be looking for your PowerPoint presentation and you might go to your terminal, type a different magic incantation. Now, if you were looking to fix your MATLAB in a Mac environment, you take a different set of actions, or for finding your PowerPoint. Okay, so the way we often think about this kind of making this kind of decisions is that we identify 4 states of the world, and for stimuli, for example, and for actions, and we learn their associations. And what I think is happening rather is that we structure this information into rules that are generalizable. So for example, in front of a Linux computer, you might select a set of Linux rules that tell you what to do in response to 2 different stimuli. And in front of a Mac computer, you might select a Mac set of rules that tells you what to do in response to those same stimuli. Okay, so this time we still have 4 actions, but we only have 2 stimuli at a lower level. And at a higher level, we are making 2 more abstract decisions in response to 2 more abstract states that you can call context 1 and context 2, maybe. And the choice you're making here are rules, or what we call task sets, sets of stimulus action associations. Okay, so why do we think this is a useful theoretical framework? Well, it's because if you do that, you're going to be able to generalize in multiple ways. Okay, and I think actually those two types of generalizations match to the two types of generalization that Linda mentioned earlier. So in one way, you can generalize to new contexts. So you can get a new computer and very quickly realize that the same rules that you were using for this computer are going to be valid in this case. And that's going to be very few shot learning, because you just have to realize that these are the same set of rules that are valid, and then you're going to be able to apply everything that's inside this rule. The second way in which you can generalize is if you learn new information in any of those contexts. So for example, you learn to do something new that you didn't know how to do. So in response to this stimulus, pick action 5. This new information you learn is not going to be credited only to the context in which you learn it, but it's going to be credited to the rule itself. And by doing this, it's going to generalize immediately to all contexts in which this rule applies. Okay, so in the lab, we study this with much more simple stimuli that are, for example, colored shapes, and we try to understand how participants learn this. And the experiments themselves are very simple. We have participants see simple colored shapes, for example, in a given trial, make a choice between one of 4 actions. So they press a key, and at first they do this completely randomly. They don't know what to do. They get feedback for their choice, and this feedback is reliable and deterministic. So it's just correct if they pick the right key and incorrect otherwise. And then they go on to a next trial, and the trials are randomly interleaved in a given phase of the experiment. Okay, so if you do that, and if you have participants learn those associations at first, for example, here we have 3 colors and 2 shapes, and those are the associations, you could imagine that participants learn this exactly with this kind of representations, which we call the flat representation. But instead, you could think that they learn it in this hierarchical representation, because red and gray shapes here have the same correct actions. And so what we think is happening is that participants might learn a rule that tells you what these triangle and circle correct actions are, rule 1, task set 1 here, and also learn the association between this context and this task set, and also a different task set for this third context. Okay, so how can we test if they do that? Well, one simple way is to give participants new shapes in the second phase of the experiment, for example, a diamond that still respect the structure. So the red diamond and the gray diamond still have the same correct shape. Okay, and if you do that, and if you have created this structure, you still have to learn, right? So the first time you see the yellow diamond, you still have to pick randomly an action, and so your odds are going to be 1/4. But now if you pick the red diamond and pick action 1 and get a correct answer, your odds were 1/4. But now what this model is going to tell you is that you're not crediting this correct choice to the red diamond. You're crediting it to the diamond in the context of rule 1. And by doing so, you're going to have, I think what Linda called zero-shot generalization to the gray diamond. You're going to say, well, I've never tried action 1 with a gray diamond, but I know that when I see gray, I should select rule 1, and rule 1 tells me to select action 1 for the red diamond. So I should be able to generalize this immediately. Okay, and that's what we find in participants. We find that they learn faster those new shapes for those 2 colors in which that correspond to the same rule compared to the other color that corresponds to a new rule. We also find the other type of transfer. So in the third phase, we can show participants new colors this time with the same old shapes, and see if they're going to try to reuse old rules in this case. Okay, and the idea here is that again, they have to learn. They have to get some information first, right? So they might try action 1 for the blue triangle at the beginning, and the first time they will get this correct feedback, they might credit this to selecting task set 1 right? Because task set 1 tells you to select action 1 in response to the triangle. And so if you do that, then you'll say, okay, I selected task set 1 and I got rewarded. And so that might help you make the inference that this new color should be also selecting task set 1. And if you do so, then the first time you see the blue circle, you should be better than changed, because you should the blue color should make you select task set 1, and then task set 1 should make you select action 2 for the circle. And so you should be better at this than for selecting a context in a context that requires a new set of association, and that's what we observed in participants. Okay, so it seems like we generalize new stimulus action associations learned in one context to other contexts sharing a known rule, and we generalize rules learned in a null context to new contexts. Okay, so next we wanted to ask what computational mechanisms could support generalizing rules. And sorry for the typo here. So we proposed a model based on inference of latent rules, and those rules themselves would be learned by reinforcement learning. Okay, so reinforcement learning allows us to learn associations between stimulus and action associations. And what we're saying is that we also want to learn associations between those contexts and those stimuli. And you could do this in a flat way by representing the conjunction of all possible all possible contexts and stimuli. But what we propose instead is that you have this abstract, not directly observable variable here. That's the rule, that's the transfer, and that we're going to try to cluster together contexts, not contexts that are similar perceptually, right? Not blue and dark blue, but contexts that require you to behave similarly in an environment. So to do that, we need a prior over this latent space. And because we don't know the size of this latent space, we need a non-parametric prior. And we use the Chinese restaurant process prior, because this allows us to be more likely to generalize a popular prior compared to a less popular prior, but also allows us to create a popular task set, but also allows us to create a completely new task sets. Okay, so with this structure of a model and approximate Bayesian inference over this latent space, we can recapitulate really well participants' data in this specific experiment and a few others. Okay, so this seems to tell us that participants really create this kind of hierarchical rules in which they cluster contexts together, indexed by those task set rules, which provides them ability to generalize in two different ways. But also to explore new situations using those rules rather than using simple actions at the same time. Okay, so the way we're representing things here is by saying that we have a learning algorithm that learns to select stimulus and actions in response to stimuli at a low level. But we have this also at a high level where we learn to select rules in response to context. And this is hierarchical in the sense that the task set selection here constrains the action selection at the bottom. Okay, and the way we did this so far is by assuming that participants use reinforcement learning at the bottom and Bayesian inference at the top. And we were a little bit unsatisfied with that because it's tricky to think about how this inference might be happening in the brain. And we have evidence that reinforcement learning could also be happening at over more abstract states and actions that are the context and task sets. The corticobasal ganglia loops that go from premotor cortex to striatum and that enable reinforcement learning also exists at higher levels of prefrontal hierarchy, for example, between prefrontal cortex and striatum. And so the same circuits could also be learning to select those abstract choices, those rules in response to context, and then constrain this at the lower level. And we showed this in a neural network model with Michael Frank in the past. But we wanted to test this prediction more specifically, that this RL algorithm might be doing this generalization at both levels, this learning at both levels in humans. So we wanted more specific predictions for this. Okay, the idea that you might learn the value not just of a state and an action, but also the value of a task set and a context, and that this would be what you would base your policy on. So the model makes the prediction that you should track two sets of reinforcement learning values over two different levels of state and action spaces that are more or less abstract. My grad student Maria Eckstein ran this experiment and indeed found evidence for this. For example, showing that participants were able to select the more valuable of two task sets slightly better than the more valuable of two stimuli, which is a prediction of this model that cannot be obtained with a Bayesian inference at the top or a flat reinforcement learning model. Okay, so the take home of this part is that we learn a hierarchical role structure that enables transfer and faster exploration, and that this may be implemented via multiplex reinforcement learning computations over multiple state and action spaces. And I see that I'm late, so I'm going to have to go through my second part a little bit faster. So I won't give you all the details of the experiment, but just the big gist of it, because I think it's of interest to this community. So far we've talked about hierarchy in a way that allows generalization, about a state hierarchy where we're grouping together things that require you to act the same way. But there's also something called temporal hierarchy, where you might be making choices at a high level of temporal definitions. For example, you might receive an invitation to give a talk at CCN GAC, and you might make the choice to give this talk. Okay, but you could subdivide this into multiple sub-steps, like accepting and sending an abstract and prepping a talk, and each one could be subdivided into smaller and smaller sub-steps, like typing an email and sending it, etc. And this is called temporal abstraction. And the field of hierarchical learning has looked a lot into this temporal abstraction in the domain of what is called options. And options are just temporally extended policies in environments in which your choices influence what the next state of the world is. And options have been shown to be, so it would be, for example, a policy to go to this door rather than relying on individual local steps here. Okay, and there's lots of theoretical work that has shown that you can learn much faster, explore faster, and generalize with options. So we wanted to see if this could be, this could provide the same type of flexibility and generalization in humans as we've shown previously with simple rules and task sets. Okay, so going back to our setup of earlier, we said that we're selecting at multiple levels, making reinforcement learning choices at multiple levels in the domain of selecting a task set that constrains an action selection in response to a stimulus. So really a task set is just a one-step policy. In comparison, an option is a temporally extended policy. And so we could have the exact same diagram where we could replace here task set with options and apply the same theoretical framework to this, just adding this temporal structure into it. So we ask whether our findings on hierarchical role learning extended to options by asking if humans learn options through reinforcement learning, and whether they can do this at multiple hierarchical levels, and whether they can generalize these options at different hierarchical levels to improve exploration and speed up learning. Okay, I'm getting over my time, so I think I won't have a chance to present the experiment itself, unfortunately. I would like to show you very quickly the results. So the theoretical framework is identical to the task set one before, where we assume that there's latent rules that allow us to select option in response to stimuli. The options are as defined in the hierarchical reinforcement learning framework. So we are replacing those task sets here with options. But we do this at multiple levels of temporal hierarchy at the same time. And when we do this, what we find is that humans can generalize options at multiple levels of hierarchy. So this one is showing you generalization of options at a very high level of hierarchy. It's showing that you're making transfer errors and that the model can capture it, and that you can also generalize options at smaller levels of hierarchy. So this seems like it's a really good framework to capturing how humans generalize in domains where there are sequential dependencies in your choices. Okay, so I'm sorry I went overboard, over long, and didn't have time to show the results of this second experiment. And I hope you'll just take my word for it that we can extend all this hierarchical reinforcement learning framework for generalization to just slightly more complex and interesting policies, and that captures well human learning. Okay, thank you all for your attention. I'd like to thank in particular Maria and Jimmy who did the work, and Michael who collaborated on the who was my advisor for the first part of those studies. Thank you.
I think that there is a question maybe we can answer Anne about your talk. I think the Apruba is actually having the question to you. So can I read it maybe? So yeah, the question is,
yes,
hi
Anne.
Yeah, hi Anne. Could you give a thought of what are the key implications of your result for the nature of the relational representations one would expect to support the computational mechanism you discussed? For example, would it make sense to represent context in a map that clusters by TS, but does not explicitly represent a latent task set?
Sorry, is the question in the Q&A?
Yeah, yeah, sorry.
Okay,
so you can find it in the Q&A, maybe the bottom part, because it's new.
I can think about it. Okay. Okay, so I'm not completely sure I get the question, so I'm happy to talk more about it later. But I think essentially what I'm trying to say is that the nature of the similarity you would need to consider to explain this kind of generalization is very different from the usual thoughts about creating a psychological space of the context, because it doesn't take into account the features of the context itself, but how you act in this context. And so it's really those features that matter for the generalization rather than the features of the context in itself, the perceptual features, or even the cognitive features of it. And so I think it makes a fairly different kind of prediction about about what the right map would be, right? It would completely ignore or mostly ignore all the perceptual or cognitive features of that context in favor of the behavioral, the features that tell you something about how you interact with it. I'm not sure if I answered your question in the program, but hopefully.
So there may be the one more question, and after that we can maybe move to the next one. So next question from Erie, that Anne. Hi Anne, do you think that it could, so you can find it actually in the bottom in the Q&A, yeah. So hi Anne, do you think there could be also an explicit representation of the abstract hierarchical structure of the task and contextual rule in the brain?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I've haven't gone after explicitly, and my past research has given has given me conflicting intuitions about this. So there's been cases in which I've tried to ask participants explicitly about their structure, and I've seen no relationship between their answer and their performance. And there's been cases in which I have seen a relationship between what they report explicitly as the structure they think is in the task and their performance. So I have contradicting evidence for this. So I think there could certainly be cases in which that's the case, but I don't think it has to be. the case necessarily, and arguably I've never designed a task specifically to ask this question. So, you know, future research potential. Thank you.
Linda?
Okay, so
thanks everybody.
Thanks for the very nice talk. So we are now in the panel discussion. So maybe Linda and I will just asking some questions during that time. Maybe you can type in the question in the Q&A box. Also, when the other panel answer the question, maybe the other panel can check about what kind of question that you want to answer during the panel discussion. So maybe I can start from the question to Anne. And so I really want to see more about the second part of the data. I think it's Jimmy's data, but I'm sorry that no, it's my story that we cannot give them more time. But so my question is more likely how does the brain actually compute which level of the abstraction is efficient? So that is that in experiment lab in the experiment it might be more easier, but in the real life actually there's no clear boundary. So how the brain know that which state or which sequence of the action you call the options can jointly or compositionally generalized. So, and I think that the hierarchical model might be doing some kind of thing in the hierarchically, but I just want to know that how the brain can do this kind of computations.
Yeah, so I won't have a very good answer for you, but I think a direction for an answer is actually a slide I skipped, where I had showed actually in the first paper I published on this question, or one of the first papers I published on this question, that people do this kind of structure learning even when it's not beneficial. So it seems to be a very default kind of behavior. So my idea is that probably the brain just creates too much structure at first, and probably lots of irrelevant structure, and might over time just prune the one that's not relevant. So there might be some mechanism. Essentially, the way I can imagine this happening is that all of information goes at all levels, and maybe stochasticity or maybe other kinds of priors make you more likely to think of to emphasize different aspects of information at different levels. And people have this strong bias to create structure, and so might be creating this structure and over time inferring whether it's useful, and if there's more than one, which one is useful. So that's this is not data driven. I don't have I don't have evidence for any of this, but that's my intuition for how this might be possible.
I have a question for Anne as well. And I think this was related to one of the questions that was submitted. I guess the question is whether there's a continuous space of task sets. So if one task set is related to the other one, for example, rotation, or there's some sort of, I guess, even more abstract space of the task set, how would you be able to represent that in your models?
So, so you can think of this. I think I would answer differently your question if I'm thinking of things more continuously or discretely. So there could be task sets that are very similar to each other in terms of which action. So for example, you could have 8 stimulus action associations, and one of them is shared. 7 of them are shared and one of them is not. And in which case the question is, do you actually create 2 task sets, or do you create some kind of shared representation that has exceptions or something like that? So I think that's part of your question, but in a discrete way. And I don't really have the answer to that. We're actually trying to we're actually building experiments right now to try to get at this question, like what happens when there's lots of overlap between task sets. Are people able to create this separation, or is there strong interference between that? Then I think a second aspect of your question is what about other aspects of generalization, right? So I've kind of pretended that the features of perception don't matter, but that's of course a bit silly, right? Because Mac computers all look alike, and Linux computers, you can usually perceive that there's something similar. So I've tried to completely abstract away this information, but it might be there, and that might be that might be something that is present in the information in such a way that we can create those clusters, not just taking into account similarity in how we behave in them, but also similarity in how they are perceptually. So I think you could extend this kind of models to taking this into account, you know, to taking similarity, you know, perceptually relevant similarity into account to bring in information into the generalization. It would be an extension.
Cool, thanks. And then I think we
Thanks
have
for the question.
For Andrea. Matt, do you want to ask your question, or should I just read? I guess I can read it. Matt Astor says, I wonder if you could talk a bit about how the formation of grids in your model differ from successor-based grids, which presumably be unable to find the shortcut in your last slide.
Yeah, I saw the question. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think it's interesting, and we have actually, it's funny because we have been looking a lot into the weights of the linear layer, trying to look for like if they are doing any sort of PCA or eigen decomposition of actually our targets. You know, like it's Kim worked with us, and so we Kim Stackenfeld worked with DeepMind as well. So we look a lot into that because we are looking for similarities of the two methods, but we weren't able to find those. And I think the problem, the difference there, I ended up thinking, I don't have a clear answer, but I ended up thinking it must be related to how the gradients affect those weights, which is something very difficult to analyze. In order to directly answer your question, I'm not sure. I guess you might be able to take shortcut with enough coverage, or it also depends on how you're going to read out your grid cell, I guess. But I need to think a little bit more about that. I've not been working for a long time on these topics, so. I guess there are differences because we derive grids in different ways. So there might be information in our method that are not present in the other, but it's difficult to tear apart.
Andrea, I have another question. So actually, I also find that there is a similar question in the audience. Like Rob Mock is actually having a very interesting question, and also a very similar question, which is that my question is about the continuous dimension and the discrete dimension. So yeah, I think that the same system representing the relationship in the continuous dimension might be a little bit easier for the AI system, and also maybe true for the brain. But I just want to know that how is it difficult for the AI to learn the different events happening in the different time, and they need to put together and trying to make some kind of the conceptual map. And do you think is it possible to make it AI to think like that, and was it possible challenging about this one?
You mean make the AI think in terms of a more discrete, in a more discrete manner?
Yeah. So yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. Exactly.
Okay. I think the first difference we should keep in mind is that when we use computers, they have infinite precision in the weights we can have, which is not true for the brain. So that's why, for instance, to get grids emerge in our system, we had to introduce noise in the form of noise, both in the gradients and in the activations. Having said that, I think there are lots of efforts from there is a large community that is actually thinking of making like more discrete activation for neural networks, or to make the neural networks learn very disentangled representations that would basically serve the same, if I understand correctly your question, that will serve the same purpose. However, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if the grid cell are like the right thing for that. To be honest, I like the recent work from Rob Monk. Actually, I think I'm quite aligned to that view, and from Breedlove view as well. That I guess it really depends on the domain and how much you can sample your domain. Because if you can like completely sample your domain, which is most of the time the case in 2D experiment, like special to the navigation experiment, but also like in the stretchy bird experiment. I discussed that with Tim, by the way, Tim Behrens, and also the tank experiment in audio. They basically sample the whole space that they then test. And I think if that's the case, then like representing that space with a place cell-like code in combination with a grid cell code, it's actually a good thing to do. But if your space is not fully, you cannot fully sample it, right? Think about language, right? In language, we have a discrete set of words, but we can generate an infinite set of sentences with that. So if you try to do that with a discrete code, then you will basically get complexity of exponent of n being the number of words, which gets quickly intractable, right? So I think there, something like a distributed code, like more continuous code, I think it would serve the purpose much better. So I don't think, basically this is to say, I don't think the grid cell are the answer to everything. They might be when it's discrete and it's fully sampleable, but otherwise, I think it's tricky.
Andrea, there is a question from Iri and Amol in the bottom. Maybe you can find it in there. I think they're quite relevant questions. So
yeah.
What Iri's question is actually that the grid representation is critical for the efficient performance. And can you comment on the biological implementation of the goal grid representation and how you might able to measure it? And also the Amol asking that what is the insight, any insight into the condition that read the grid cell like activation? I think like
Okay, I start from the last one. And the conditions are, as I said, having noise in the gradients, and we did it very brutally. The way we did it is to basically have clipping the gradients, and when you clip the gradient, one of the properties is that you don't only change the magnitude of the gradient, but you also change the direction of it. So you make the network looking for areas of the solution space which might not be immediately the one that the network will look for. And the second is dropout, which is again like a way to avoid overfitting normally, and we use it quite massively to regularize the linear layer. Regarding the question about the goal grid code, I'm not an experimentalist, so I have no idea where like what could be the biological implementation, but I guess if I have to guess, I mean, it could be like PFC setting like a goal for you, or like maybe sourcing from memory the goal you want to achieve, and maybe this, by the way, this is like very handshaky, so that could be like my first reaction by not being an experimentalist.
Do we think that in terms of the time, maybe we better to start the next session? Is it okay, Linda? Do you think?
Yeah. How are we doing on time?
Yeah. So thanks very much for the speakers. And if everybody have a more question and the discussion, maybe we can also email, or you can using more general like a Slack or something later, maybe. Yeah. But I'm going to start the next session. So. So welcome to the experiment session. I'm so excited to have two other great speakers in this session. So our first speaker is actually the Miriam Klein-Flüge. Miriam's research is focused on the fundamental neural mechanism underlying the learning and decision making. And she was working not only the human subject, but also with the non-human primate. And moreover, I'm very impressed that her works managed to span the computational model and also the multi-modal neuroimaging technique, including like fMRI, TMS, and even transcranial ultrasound stimulation. So today she will talk about the grid-like representation of the value space in medial prefrontal cortex, guide value integration during novel decision making in Macaque. Here's Miriam.
Thank you so much, Simin. I think it's a really great honor to be invited to this workshop, which has been really interesting so far. So thank you so much to the organizers. I think I wanted to start by saying that all the projects that I'm going to present are actually part of the PhD of Alessandro Bongiorno, who you can see here on the screen. Can you see the screen okay and my pointer?
Yes, very well.
Perfect. And so Alessandro was jointly supervised in his PhD by Matthew and myself, but really all the hard work collecting the data and analyzing it really is thanks to him. So he gets all the credit. But I'll start with a very general introduction, and some of it I think I can go through quite quickly given the beautiful introductions you have given to this GAC workshop already. But basically we started from the place where we know that there's quite a lot of evidence now for where value representations and decision signals are encoded in the brain. But strangely, somehow, the focus on where decision signals are recorded has been on orbitofrontal cortex for a lot of studies in macaque monkeys and on medial frontal cortex, as we've had already for studies conducted in humans. And so, for example, it is known that when we record neurons in macaque orbitofrontal cortex here, these neurons encode the values of options that an animal learns incrementally through repeated exposure. And these neurons can also be active in relation to the comparison between two choice options. By contrast, as everyone here will be familiar with by now, this is one of Erie's earliest work, but when we look at decision-making activity in humans, usually it is most prominent in medial frontal cortex, and especially when we look for these signatures that are indicative of a value comparison process. Okay, so this is quite relevant when we look at the anatomical networks that these two regions are part of. So here you can see work from quite a lot of different tracer studies summarized, and that highlights these two different anatomical networks. One is a medial network shown in blue that connects medial prefrontal cortex that we just discussed with entorhinal cortex, hippocampus, and a lot of the cingulate areas. And then there's this other more lateral or orbital network shown in red, which connects the orbitofrontal region where a lot of macaque recordings were taken from, including central and more lateral OFC, with more higher order visual sort of temporal regions, so more lateral temporal cortex regions. And so really the sort of decision activation that we record in macaques come from quite a different network that includes, that gets input about higher visual processing, while the activation we see in humans comes from this more medial area, which we know processes emotions, motivation, and self-referential processes. So why do we see such different areas in the two species? Well, it's obvious to everyone, I think, but there's something else that is fundamentally different between human and macaque experiments. And that's that in animal experiments, typically we train the animals for quite a long time, and they gradually learn about the stimuli and are overtrained by the time we usually record from the neurons in their brain. While in real world decisions, we usually make decisions very spontaneously, as many people have talked about already before. And so in our human designs, generally we give participants their instructions, and then we expect that they make first time decisions between options just based on inferences from the instructions or from previously encountered options in the training. So this involves potentially quite a different process of simulating novel combinations of features that they've never previously experienced in that way. Okay, so I'll give you an example, also partly to honor Alessandro. So he comes from Italy, and so in the past, often as an example that you might have to choose between, he has shown these two cities and you might have not been to either of them, and yet you will still probably be able to make this choice based on your inference memory of having been to medieval cities in the past, or having been to cities close to the sea in the past. But unfortunately, that is not a very timely example anymore, and we don't make choices like that very much at the moment. So we might have to decide how during home office we stay fit, but still you can probably make this choice despite not having ever been on an equipment piece like this, just because we know how we felt cycling in the past or how we like being indoors versus outdoors, etc. And so there's one final observation that motivated our study that intrigued us, and as I know many people in this workshop, as became clear in sort of Linda's and Simon's early introduction, and that's that these medial frontal cortex regions that we find often in highlighting choice competitions in our human experiments are very much overlapping with those where we see grid calls in medial frontal cortex. And so even though we can't record directly, it's been said already earlier that we can still use fMRI to look for this hexagonal modulation of the signal. And the advantage is that we can look in the whole brain. And there's multiple studies now that show not just in the spatial domain, but also in order space or this bird space and in a hierarchical social space, that basically medial frontal cortex has this hexagonal modulation. And so we wondered if the overlap between decision-making activation and grid coding might have to do with the fact that during decision-making in our typical human tasks, we asked participants to simulate different axes along which choice options might vary and might be combined. So that brings me to the aim of these experiments that I'm going to present. Basically, what we wanted to ask is, can macaque monkeys perform inferential choices that involve simulating novel combinations of features? And basically that require this online computation of value that we're so used to doing in human experiments. And if they can do so, would such choices recruit a medial frontal cortex network rather than the OFC circuit that we've seen recruited in many recording studies in macaques? And would such choices rely on a grid-like coding of this non-physical value space? Okay, so in total, 4 macaques took place in this experiment. And as typically done in studies with non-human primates, they were first trained extensively on 2 sets of stimuli. So in the first one, you can see that the color of the cue indicates the magnitude of reward, which is simply the drops of juice they receive, but the probability is fixed at 0.6. And in the second set, the density of dot varies and indicates the probability with which they will receive reward, but the magnitude, so the number of drops, is fixed. And so they see these stimulus sets for about 13,000 trials on average across these 4 monkeys and over a 3-month period. So they are very extensively trained and have a lot of experience with these stimuli and know them extremely well. And as you would have already worked out by now, these 2 stimulus sets make up this cross in a larger 2-dimensional space spanned of the probability and the magnitude of reward. And so we call this our abstract value space, much of which remained unexplored during training. So all the white spaces basically are novel stimuli that have never experienced before. And it is at this point that basically we started the main part of the experiment where we really looked at neural signals. So keep in mind, they had never previously seen or had the experience of any of these stimuli in white. Okay, so at this point we conducted these 3 different experiments. Experiment 1 and 2 happened on interleaved days. Both of them involved fMRI, as you can see here. And so the first was to probe the neural representations of mechanisms that govern novel decision-making, so decision-making between these novel choice options that they'd never seen before. The second one was looking at the representation of these values in this 2-dimensional value space. And then in the third experiment, we used focused ultrasound, which is a unique technique that can focally disrupt activity, even deep in the brain, to study the behavioral effect of causally disrupting the network. Okay, so in experiment 1, as you can see here, monkeys repeatedly chose either between 2 familiar options, so that they had a lot of experience with from the sort of scanning prior to entering the scanner, or between 2 unfamiliar options that they never experienced before. Stimuli represented until the monkeys made a decision, but usually their median reaction time was around 1 second, so they usually responded quickly. There was then a delay so that we could dissociate the decision from the outcome, and then an upward or downward triangle indicated to them if they were successful and got a juice reward through a spout or not. And importantly, the stimuli on those familiar and novel choice trials were visually very similar, and they were also matched in terms of the difficulty, so in terms of the expected value difference. The only difference between them was their experience with them, or sort of their reinforcement histories. So then I'm showing you here the monkey's performance. I'm showing the probability of choosing the right stimulus as a function of right minus left value. And you can see it for all 4 monkeys. And basically what we found is that these curves looked pretty much exactly the same for both novel and familiar trials. So I'm just showing them here collapsed for you, but they were statistically the same, which told us that basically monkeys chose accurately even between stimuli they had never previously seen or experienced. So behaviorally, they are able to do these novel inferential choices, just like human participants do all the time, which maybe shouldn't be surprising. In the bold data, we then wanted to first establish this signature for decision-making across both novel and familiar trials. And so we know from previous work that probably most people in the audience will be familiar with using cortical attractor network models originally suggested by Dr. Wang and then adapted by Lawrence Hunt and Behrens for use in neuroimaging, that the key signature we need to look for in bold data for looking at the choice computation is this difference between the value of the chosen and the value of the unchosen option. And so for this contrast, we looked at all trials across novel and familiar, and we found this cluster, quite a large cluster of activation in the orbitofrontal surface, very near where, or exactly where recordings would have usually been taken in those studies I mentioned at the beginning. This is area 1113. And so this region cared about the value difference, so the expected value difference between the chosen and the unchosen option, but independently of whether familiar or novel options had to be compared. By contrast, we then next looked for regions where this signature of value difference was stronger for choices involving comparison of novel options. So basically now looking at the same, but in novel minus familiar. And we found a large cluster of activation here in the medial surface of the frontal cortex in area 32, extending into 14M and 10. And we were really pretty excited about this, as you can imagine, given the long introduction, because this region seemed really similar to the human brain region active during most of our decision-making tasks. And that's both in terms of cytoarchitecture and functional interactions. But it has been explored in macaques, just a lot less so far. And so we find this value comparison signal in OFC versus a novelty effect that specifically does the value comparison in MFC when it's between novel options. So next in study, or in the second experiment, we wanted to understand how decisions between novel options were actually possible. So the second experiment was, as I said earlier, interleaved with experiment 1 and was also performed in the scanner. And so we investigated the nature of individual options. So basically asking what mechanisms allow inference of these novel option values. So as you can see here, monkeys did not have to make choices. They were just presented with a single option. All the options in this experiment were novel options. Those were the ones we were particularly interested in. And so we basically then manipulated the relationship between options on successive trials. So first we looked for areas that represent the identity of a specific option. And here we exploited the fMRI activity suppression that you see when the same neural representation gets activated twice on successive trials. And so we compared a scenario where an identical stimulus was shown in succession twice with a scenario where the stimulus differed on both dimensions of values. In this contrast, we found suppression of the bold signal in this quite anterior orbitofrontal cortex region, so a little bit more anterior to the region we found in experiment 1. And so we know from this suppression then that this region cares about the identity of specific options. And it's important to say that this signal built up with experience, so it became stronger as we had several sort of sessions, 5 in total for experiment 2. This was particularly strong in the last. And it isn't possible to interpret it as just a value signal. Obviously, any two identical stimuli will also have the same value. But when we looked for suppression, that was for two stimuli that have the same value, expected value, but a different visual representation, there wasn't suppression that was in this region to the same. Okay, so within the same experiment, still staying with this single option experiment, we also wanted to characterize the nature of this medial frontal cortex signal. So given that value could be constructed along 2 dimensions, everyone knows what is coming because of the name of the symposium. And so we wondered whether novel inferences might be supported by a grid code. Quite a few papers, so I can basically skip this part, have shown now that some way of looking at hexagonal modulation in MRI is to look at whether a trajectory is aligned or misaligned with the grid and look for this 6-fold modulation of the signal. And there are some people in this symposium or workshop who have looked at this in very beautiful ways, both in spatial and non-spatial. So we basically looked for the same signature, 6-fold symmetry that is indicative of an underlying grid in our data. So in our case here, the choice space the macaques navigate is encoded by a grid cell-like pattern. Sorry, hang on, what was it? So if in our case here, if the choice space that macaques navigate is encoded by a grid cell-like pattern, then this rapid succession between 2 stimuli may activate a grid representation that might be underlying it. So Basically, a trajectory, as shown in red, in our case, between two locations would be determined by the option you saw on the previous trial and the option you are currently seeing on the current trial. And so we are just asking, is the angle of this trajectory aligned or misaligned with the potential underlying grid? And when we looked at the map of regions that was modulated by such a six-fold symmetry, we found a pronounced cluster in the medial frontal cortex. Again, very much overlapping with that we had identified for novel decision-making. We did not find effects like this in the orbitofrontal cortex, but there was also some hexagonal modulation in entorhinal cortex, albeit quite a lot weaker. So MFC, but not ORFC, integrates novel stimulus dimensions using a grid code that spans, in our case, this value and non-physical space. We then used an independent RI from experiment 1 to test if this six-fold modulation in medial frontal cortex was specific to the hexagonal symmetry or occurred for any other periodicities as well. And you can see that it was specific here to the six-fold modulation, as we would expect. But the hexagonal modulation did not reach significance in our hands in ORFC or entorhinal cortex, which obviously could be due to not having sufficient signal here, as if we can't know for sure why we don't see it. We also tested whether the average phase difference between grid orientation estimates from two interleaved trial subsets from each session were smaller than expected by chance. And so we do find some grid orientation consistency. It's not super consistent, it's not close to zero, but it is smaller than you would expect by chance. But interestingly, this is just true within a session. If we take independent halves of a session, we did not find this grid orientation consistency across, which could be to do with the fact that we had experiment 1 on interleaved days with experiment 2, so they always had some choice sessions in between these sessions where we just presented single options. This is a plot I'm just showing given the audience. It looks quite noisy, but we also looked whether the MFC grid code changed across sessions. So now we have a lot less data in each sort of bin. So we're plotting the 4 monkeys across the 5 sessions that they performed. And you can see that the effect size of the grid of the hexagonal modulation basically looks like it might be slightly increasing over time, but that is not a significantly statistically significant trend. So for us, it looks like the grid code was there from the beginning and kept constant. Maybe with more data, or maybe the study that this group of people is planning to do in humans, where you have 20 or 40 people, you might be able to get at that better than we were here. Okay, so this brings me to the third and last experiment, so I will wrap up quite soon. And basically in this experiment, we validated an implication of experiment 1 and 2, which basically the rationale was that if this MFC grid code really supports the integration of the 2 dimensions in this 2-dimensional space, then if we can disrupt this map in medial frontal cortex, we should particularly affect the ability to make novel decisions based on the integrated value of the 2 options. And I'll make that a little bit clearer in a minute, but basically we achieved this temporary disruption using this new technique that I mentioned at the beginning, focused ultrasound, and we used an offline procedure, which means we applied 40 seconds of TUS to either this site of interest in medial frontal cortex or a control site still in medial frontal cortex, but much more ventral and posterior. So a conservative control, we think. And basically what we know from other work in the lab that TUS applied for 40 seconds focally to a region alters brain activity in the stimulated region for up to an hour, if not more, likely more than an hour. So we had plenty of time to give the monkeys the choice task to do again. So very similar to experiment 1, they were now making choices, but all the time between novel options. Or at least we're focusing on the novel options because they are. And so then we fitted a subjective value model to each session. And here what we wanted to get at really is whether monkeys are still integrating across the 2 dimensions or not. So when we're to get at that is to look at value formed additively and multiplicatively. So an additive way of sort of putting the value of an option together would be to just do a weighted sum of the magnitude and the probability that is offered, while multiplicative value would be constructed by taking the product, as the name says. And so basically in our model, among other parameters, we had this integration coefficient, which basically just captured how much the choices are driven by this multiplicative value rather than an additive value. So in other words, you can think of it as describing that when monkeys are choosing multiplicatively, they would act as if they first inferred a single integrated value for each option and then compared between these single integrated values. While if they act in a more additive way, they could basically just be comparing the magnitude and separately comparing the probability and then make a choice based on that. And so an important detail maybe for that is that here we only included conflicting trials in the sense that the magnitude would point towards the green and the probability would point to the blue option or vice versa, because those are the trials where you really need to attend to both dimensions. And what we found is that in comparison to both the sham and the control conditions, MFC TUS caused a significant reduction in this integration coefficient. So in other words, the monkeys were not basing their decisions as much anymore on an integrated multiplicative representation of value, which seems to suggest that we disrupted a map that helps to integrate across the. Okay, with that, I will wrap up and just summarize. So we found that this medial frontal cortex circuit mediates the ability to choose between new options based on little or no previous experience. This multidimensional option representation in MFC employed a grid cell-like coding scheme to integrate across dimensions in this non-physical space. And ultrasonic disruption of medial frontal cortex impaired making such choices on the basis of an integrated representation. And with that, I'd like to thank again Alessandro and Matthew most of all, and also Davide Foloni, Leonard Verhagen, and Jerome Saleh, our funders, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much.
Very nice, amazing result. And yeah, maybe we can just keep go to the next talk, and we can just combine the question in the discussion, panel discussion. So yeah. Yeah, so our next speaker is actually Matthias van der Meer, and Matthias is an associate professor in Dartmouth College, and he used animal model to explain how the cortical hippocampal network actually learn and represent the complex environment. And his findings have a strong implication not only for the spatial navigation, but also more broadly like learning, memory, and decision making. So today he will talk about his recent finding about the shared representation geometry in the rodent hippocampus. So I believe that this finding led us to have interesting discussion after that, how the grid code maybe also serve to the constructed representation of the world. Here's Matthias.
Hi, everyone, and thanks very much to the organizers for putting on this fantastic workshop and for inviting me. So I don't actually work on grid cells, and I do have some experience in working with rodents on a variety of spatial decision-making tasks. Let me make sure I get my slides here. Okay, does that look okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. All right. And so in my lab, we are interested in memory, value, and decision-making, and we study those kind of topics with particular focus on the hippocampus and the ventral striatum and their interaction. And we study those in rodents. I won't talk about any of our ventral striatum work, but instead we'll discuss this one study where we've tried to apply techniques that were really inspired by human cognitive neuroscience of saying how well can you predict across subjects how a given experience might be encoded. So to put that in a little bit of context, you know, in the hippocampus, for the longest time, people have been studying this phenomenon of remapping, which describes how the place cell code changes across different environments that you might put an animal in. So in the sort of canonical example, there are two different rooms, A and B, where you can see individual place cells kind of changing where in a physically similar box, they end up being active, and some cells move where they fire, other cells turn off. And it seemed on the face of it that that phenomenon was very hard to predict, that it seemed like there was no relationship between the activity of a given cell in environment A and that in B. And in sort of an extension of that work, in this this paper, they actually tested across not just 2, but 11 different rooms to what extent this remapping seemed random. And again, the main message from this study was that you can't really predict where or whether a given place cell will have a field in some different room. There's a similar story when you look within an environment. So in this particular situation, there is this sort of very long track that sort of has a sort of circular topology, but there are all these different segments at different angles. So the length of this thing in total is something like 30 meters. And what you see here are, again, place maps of 3 example cells. And you see that some cells have multiple locations where they fire. Can you see my mouse pointer, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, great. You see some cells have multiple firing locations, but there doesn't seem to be any obvious pattern to when you might expect to see the next field. So here there are a few fields kind of close together, but then there's a jump to the next field. And then here's another cell that has multiple firing locations, again, without any obvious pattern to them. And then some other cells maybe have only 1 firing location. And so Albert Lee's group at Janelia in this paper concluded that this was best described by basically a Poisson process that has a rate parameter that says, well, how active is the cell overall, but has random assignment for where on the track that cell is going to be active. So again, the message is very much, if you look at these hippocampal place fields, that both across environments and on a given individual track, there might be some overall activity that is preserved across different locations or across different environments, but where exactly a cell is going to be active seems basically random. And so, the brief answer to this question of how related experiences as defined as these different environments or different locations in the same track are encoded, it kind of looks like that's pretty independent. And I guess from a pure memory perspective, like maybe that seems reasonable. Like if you have a different kind of independent or maybe even orthogonal map for different contexts, or if different locations are encoded independently, then maybe you minimize interference, like you maximize storage capacity. So in some ways that could be good if you're just trying to literally store and retrieve the maximum number of experiences. And maybe if you think about the hippocampus as purely in the service of episodic memory that is just meant to be optimized for the storage and recall of arbitrary associations, maybe that's okay. But we don't think that that's all that the hippocampus does. So, for this audience, you're probably not surprised to see transitive inference types of experiments, which are also relatively commonly done in rodents now, although not nearly as common as in human experiments. But here's a pioneering one from Howard Eichenbaum's group, where they showed that animals that had lesions involving the hippocampus, see these 2 bars here on a novel probe pair, were very much impaired compared to the control subjects in this bar here. So kind of confirming what was already known from the human literature. So now we're no longer talking about just storing and retrieving specific experiences. We're talking about organizing them in a way that permits making these novel inferences. And similarly, in the spatial navigation domain, there is much evidence that if you have animals with hippocampal damage, that they're going to be less efficient at flexible forms of spatial navigation, meaning the sorts of things that might happen when a new barrier is introduced, as in this experiment where the animal starts out in this box, tries to get to the food here, but encounters a novel barrier. That control animals, once they're familiar with this environment, find a pretty efficient way to that goal, whereas hippocampal lesioned animals, seem to take sort of a circuitous route. So again, the kind of functions that we would ascribe to the hippocampus based on this kind of experiment is not just limited to simply storing and retrieving experiences, but actually using them for some sort of, again, flexible inference of what is an efficient route to get to a goal when You can't just retrieve something that's worked in the past. So this idea that the hippocampus would really just independently encode different environments in different locations, maybe it's hard to imagine how, if that's how you were storing your experience and your world, that you could do things like this. So we figured it's worth re-examining, exactly how independent or not does the hippocampus code for different locations. And so the study that I'm about to describe was based on data that we previously collected in the lab that featured a T-maze, where an animal starts at the base of the central stem, and they can go either to the left or to the right in a free choice kind of paradigm. And so we can describe the activity of cells that we record in the hippocampus as our rats are doing this, sort of as this matrix where we have the activity of each neuron on a row, and then we have locations sort of for each different column, and you see that there are these firing fields or place cells, place fields that show up at different locations. So each row can be thought of as a linearized tuning curve that describes firing rate as a function of location. And we're going to ask some questions about how this left and right activity matrix are related or not. And again, you can see here at first glance, like this is actual data, like there doesn't seem to be a particularly obvious relationship between left and right, that you see a bunch of cells that have fields on the right here, but there isn't a corresponding sort of diagonal that shows up on the left. And just to highlight the people involved in this work, so my graduate student, Hung-Tu Chen, has really been doing all of this analysis, and my wonderful colleague, Jeremy Manning, who's a human cognitive neuroscientist working on memory, we're co-supervising Hung-Tu. And so if we first ask just some simple questions about the activity of cells in this situation, if we just simply correlated the tuning curve on the left and the right, so this is sort of a row-based correlation, right? You're just looking at a single row at a time. You average the correlation across all these cells, you see that that's indistinguishable from zero, right? So in this data set, as is true in many other data sets, there isn't an obvious relationship just in terms of a correlation between left and right. You can do the converse thing where you do a column-wise correlation. So you correlate, all the neural activity across cells or population vector with every other location. And you see that within left and right quadrants, there's this clear sort of area around the diagonal that shows that locations that are adjacent are correlated, but pretty soon after that, you fall off to basically zero. And then in the kind of quadrants that correlate left versus right, this might be slightly above zero, but again, it is very close to zero here, showing that also in terms of population vectors, there isn't an obvious relationship that you could detect just by correlations. So far, this is in line with what previous analyses have found. But the crucial idea that sort of appealed to us was to say, well, that's all talking about within a single subject, right? What if we ask whether across subjects, there is some sort of pattern that we could use to predict what right activity might look like given left activity for a given animal? So to kind of unpack that idea a little bit, suppose we now have these activity matrices for two rats, right? One that I'm going to call the source rat and one that I'm going to call the target rat. And what we're going to try to do is use information about how the left and right activity is related in this source rat to predict, given left activity in the target rat, what the right activity in the target rat is going to look like. And so the way we do that is we first do PCA on these full matrices. And we have to do that because the number of neurons that we record within a subject is not something that we can control, right? It's just sort of a consequence of the experimental particularities of that particular animal. And so once we do this PCA step, you can think of neural activity in this PCA space as a trajectory that starts, in our case, like at this choice point, and then sort of moves around in this PCA space. And so you can see for each rat, there is a left and a right trajectory in this PCA space. And these PCA spaces are subject specific, right? There's nothing yet that connects anything that these two rats are doing, or what their neural activity looks like, I should say. And so the critical step is then to use this procedure called hyperalignment, which uses translation and rotation and scaling of all these trajectories for each individual rat to find the set of subject-specific transformations into a common space that minimizes the overall distance between the neural activity trajectories across rats. So you can imagine like picking up the activity trajectories from, say, rat 2 and rotating them, scaling them so that they're going to fit what rat 1's neural activity looks like. Right? So there's a transformation that hyperalignment finds that maps each subject-specific PCA space into this common space. And again, this has been, I wouldn't say commonplace, but relatively well understood and applied in human fMRI work, but not really been applied to rodent data yet. So what this buys us is that now in this common space, we can estimate for rat 1's data, like what is the relationship between its left and right neural activity. And we can apply that transformation to some other rat's data, right? So we can say now that we found this left to right transform, we can use it to make a prediction of what the right activity would look like given this other rat's left activity. And then from that common space, we can invert the hyperalignment matrix and project back out to the target rat's PCA space, and then project that into the original like neuron space, and then have some sort of distance measure of how good is that prediction. And then we're going to compare that to a variety of control predictions. So we're now using this cross-subject procedure that we sort of loosely call a hypertransform. We're estimating a relationship in this common space to make a prediction of right activity in this case. Okay, so we want to look at that distance of how good is the prediction based on this hypertransform. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So here is one example session, a left and a right matrix of these tuning curves. And I've now ordered them so that it's a little bit easier for you to see that there really aren't any obvious correlations between left and right here. So you see this diagonal in the left data, but nothing much in the right data. And now you see here 3 predicted right matrices based on the procedure that I just outlined. And the 3 predictions are based on different source sessions, right? So we have a number of different rats, a number of different recording sessions, and so we can vary that. And you see that the prediction lines up pretty well with the actual data, like even for those cells that really didn't have a field on the left side, like there's a pretty good prediction of where those cells are going to be active on the right. And you can see here just a different target session. Again, there's no obvious relationship between the left and right matrices. And again, the prediction, it's obviously far from perfect, but you can see there's much more of a correspondence between the actual right data and these predictions than what seems like you would expect by chance. And so how are we going to quantify this? Of what are some relevant definitions of chance that we should compare these predictions to? So we do a few different things. The most important one that we started with was to break the relationship between left and right activity in the source subject, right? So the source subject, as you'll recall, is the one where we estimate the hypertransform, that relationship between left and right in the common space. So we're just going to permute the rows of the right activity so that now there isn't a systematic relationship between left and right anymore. And if we do that, we can compute a z-score that compares the prediction based on that actual like unshuffled data compared to like a surrogate distribution of predictions based on this shuffled situation. And if you just plot a histogram of that, you see that the actual prediction is systematically better, although not in every session. There's a few sessions that are worse. But across all the data from 4 different rats that we tried this, it's overall clearly better than this definition of chance. And what's also important is if you leave out that hyperalignment step, right? So you try to do left to right transform directly in PCA space, that also doesn't work nearly as well. So there's a clear difference in the error of the predictions between basing it on hyperalignment rather than just PCA only. So that hyperalignment step is important. We do a variety of other control analyses here. So if instead of permuting the rows, we shift the rows circularly, right? So for every right tuning curve in the source subject, we just pick some random number and circularly shift them so that we preserve the overall firing rate relationships between left and right, but we break, where exactly on the maze does a cell have its firing field. And then you see, okay, we're still able to do better than this shuffled chance prediction. Although now the effect is much smaller, that it's still, we're doing better than this version of chance. So we can say that the location of firing fields is important, but maybe it's not quite as important as the firing rate relationships. And again, that's probably consistent with earlier data saying that cells have some sort of overall activity parameter that is somewhat preserved across different environments or different locations. And it's much harder to predict where the actual location of that cell's activity is going to be. A couple of other important controls, like we would want to say, well, can we actually outperform what we think of as the identity prediction, right? If you actually had equal activity on left or right, like just cells that were symmetric. So we're clearly better than that particular version. And another important one is if you actually completely withhold the target subject's right data, so the data that you're trying to predict, if you withhold it from the hyperalignment step altogether, right? So it's a little confusing in that the hyperalignment step doesn't know about what is left or what is right. Like it just knows about the activity overall. So I don't consider it cheating if it is included in the hyperalignment step, but still we wanted to know what if that common space is just constructed without that right data altogether, can you still do better than chance? And you absolutely can. Although the thing that happens then is that the hypertransform prediction is much closer, although still significantly better than the PCA only version. So just to sum up what I've told you so far, what we're trying to do is predict one rat's right activity based on what we know about how that same rat represents a left choice on the same maze and the left to right relationship from some other rat, right? So we're saying, is that left-right relationship somehow preserved across subjects? And we find that it works better than all the versions of chance that we tried. And in particular, we outperformed the various shuffles or PCA only and the identity prediction. Now, an obvious next thing that we'd like to understand is, well, why does this work, right? Is there something we can point to, something we can identify to say, aha, like there's some kind of rule or some kind of principle or something that explains this? And so to start, what we did was just generated lots of simulated data sets to ask, well, under what conditions in principle can this hypertransform procedure predict across subjects? And the first thing we did was just really a sanity check. If we generated surrogate data where there was no relationship between left and right in terms of whether or where a cell has a place field, then we can't predict anything. And there's no correlations both in this column-based correlation method or on a cell by cell or row method. So that means that, okay, there's not some flaw in our analysis pipeline that means we detect structure when there is actually none. And then we tried various other things, like what if there was a exclusive OR relationship where if cells that have fields on the left are less likely to have fields on the right and vice versa. And we see, well, in principle, the algorithm can exploit that sort of structure in predicting better than chance. But if you do that, you get this negative correlation in the population vector correlation that doesn't exist in the data. So that doesn't seem to match what is actually happening. If instead you say, well, if a cell does have a field on both left and right, then maybe if it's more likely to be in the same location or have the same firing rate or basically have a shared parameter between left and right. We tried various versions of this. I think this example just shows like what if all of those particular parameters are the same. Again, you can predict across subjects, but what you get is very strong correlations that, again, are not consistent with the data. And what is consistent with the data is if instead you generate a bunch of place fields and you apply a hypertransform that is estimated from the data, then even on simulated data, what you predict is something that is consistent with the data, right? That you see these correlations here that match the actual observed data very well. So, this is really a work in progress of us trying to figure out, can we describe or put our finger on what that shared relationship is? And we just started by ruling out, some of these kind of simple situations. So we don't think it's simple rules like exclusive or cells in the same place, because even though our method can exploit those types of structure, they're not consistent with what the data shows. And based on the shuffles that we have done, like it does seem like firing rate relationships are particularly important, and there's also some contribution of firing location. And for the revision of this paper, we're now also working on a leave one out analysis where we can identify which individual neurons contribute the most to the ability to predict across subjects. And is there something that is shared by those kind of neurons? How am I doing for time? Because I guess we changed up the schedule a little bit.
I think it's okay.
Do I have 3 more minutes?
Yeah, I think so. What about the committee members? Do you think it's okay?
Yeah, I think it's okay. You can take 2 to 3 more minutes.
Yeah, okay. So I just want to raise this condition or this question that maybe is relevant to this theme of generalization, right? Of under what conditions can you have this sort of cross-subject prediction? Like, is that always possible, or is it only possible for certain kinds of relationships, like having a left and right arm of the same maze, for instance? So we ran the same analyses on a different data set that I was also involved in recording when I was a postdoc in David Reddish's lab. So in this Gupta data set, the maze was different in the sense that the left and the right arms actually had completely the same color, the same texture, and there were way fewer cues in the room that we ran the experiment in. Whereas in the carry data set that I've been talking about so far from my lab, we made explicit efforts to make the left and the right arm have different textures, to have the cues in the room being very different. And so at first glance, if you compare the carry and the Gupta data in terms of prediction versus shuffles, it looks very similar. So in our main test, for both data sets, we can predict way better across subjects than chance. However, the reason why we can do that is pretty different, that in this Gupta data, we do not outperform this identity prediction. Like if you just take a copy of the left and apply it to the right. Whereas, as I previously told you, in the carry data, it is very easy to outperform that identity prediction. And again, you can see in the correlation matrix between left and right for this Gupta data that left and right are incredibly correlated, as is also visible from these average plots here. And so I guess you can predict across subjects here, but for kind of a trivial reason, right? Not because there is a geometry, but because the way individual subjects seem to encode this task is to just sort of have a symmetric code for the left and right arms, presumably related to the cues that are available in that setting that were different from the carry data. So obviously there's a lot more that we want to do here. Like we want to be able to say, okay, what about, for instance, temporal relationships? Is trial 1 versus trial 2, if those are differently encoded, is that preserved across subjects? And of course, other ideas like across different rooms, like not just 2 arms in the same room, but boxes or environments in totally different rooms. Is it possible to identify a shared structure there? And then ideally, how does that relate to questions like behavioral generalizability, right? Because one reason why I'm thinking about this as maybe interesting is because if you have behavioral evidence for generalizing across arms or across rooms, we'd want to know, is that something that then also makes cross-subject prediction of the hippocampal code possible compared to a situation where no generalization is happening? Would that then correspond to no cross-subject prediction of these codes? And also note, we're not the only ones to ask, is remapping really non-random? Whittington et al. In this Tolman-Eichenbaum machine paper also showed there's some relationship between grid cells and place cells. So we think maybe in our data also, like even though we didn't record from grid cells, that is a likely candidate for explaining some of that cross-subject structure. But again, it would be nice to maybe model that or test that explicitly. So with that, I'll wrap up and just say this project actually got started at our Methods in Neuroscience at Dartmouth Summer School. I see there are several alumni of this summer school among the attendees. We didn't run it in 2020, but we hope to be back in 2021. So stand by for that if you're interested in learning about cutting edge methods for neuroscience data analysis. And I also want to acknowledge Alyssa Carey, former master's student in my lab, who amazingly collected this great data set, and Tu Chen, who did all the analysis, and Human Frontier Science Project, who funded the work. And thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. Actually, both of the result is surprisingly great, and I think that there's a lot of questions following. Maybe we can start the panel discussion from outside. Maybe during that time, maybe you can talk about the question too. I think that Yunjae also have a lot of questions to Matt, so maybe you can just talk about that question that while we are asking the question to Miriam, maybe. So yeah, Miriam, I have some questions. So I don't know there's answer for that, but I just want to know how you think about it. So that seems like that. Actually, there's another the question that I see somewhere, but I cannot find it anymore. Is that whether the grid self is for the representation or for the generalization. So in terms, if I'm just replacing again, I think that if it's just a representation, maybe it's just indicating where is where. So just back to like a place. But if it's related with like the valuation process itself, in that case, as you showed that maybe when this rule is changing or when they need to translate the vector into the different value, maybe the grid cell might be play some different roles. So I just want to know how you think about it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I also think it's a hard question. I don't think we've done the experiment to actually know at the moment. I think, intuitively, I want to think that maybe it's the grid could be relatively flexible and could be reused for whatever the problem is at hand. At least maybe that's how I think about the medial frontal cortex grid code. But I mean, there's obviously remapping in entorhinal cortex as well. So I think the reason for thinking MFC is really important for this is because we know it tracks what your current goal is, what sort of your current relevant decision variable is. So I think one efficient way for the brain to sort of use the grid flexibly would be to remap to a given task situation. But I mean, I think in our data, there is also maybe some reason to believe there is some generalization. I guess that's whether we believe or not from just 4 monkeys that the grid was there without any experience of the novel parts of the space. So did they generalize these trajectories that they had never experienced? And that's not generalization to a different context. It's just across the map, I guess. So there's also different levels of generalization here. So I think, I'm not sure if someone else in the panel has the answer. I don't think the experiment has been quite done, but you guys, I'm sure, will do it. But I think it would be great if the grid could systematically sort of reorient or realign itself to the rules that govern action selection and decision making to, you know, for us to behave optimally given the current setting. But I don't think I have anything but a speculation to offer for this question.
I also have a question for Miriam. I was wondering if the grid code is the thing that binds the two dimensions together, or is it maybe a byproduct of some other process? Like, is it what's, and also you don't have choices in that, the grid, specifically the grid part of the study. And but do you think, so you wouldn't get RTs, but this is one of the questions that was asked in the Q&A. More generally, do you think that is there really some sort of mental travel going on where an RT to a potential choice would depend on how far they have to travel?
Yeah, so many questions in one. So I think one question is related to whether or not this is related to there being a choice. So as you say, in our task, we saw the hexagonal modulation when they were transitioning through one option at a time. So you can think of it maybe as them simulating a trajectory through space, but they were you know, individual experiences. So they didn't have to simulate like in Alexa Konstantinescu's bird space, where they actually sort of simulated the trajectory. That wasn't the case here. And one thing we looked for, but didn't find, is for a grid code also between the choice option in experiment 1. So I didn't show this because it's a null result, and I guess there's many explanations for it, and there was enough time to go into it. But we looked at whether just the trajectory from the left to the right option, or the chosen to the unchosen option, is hexagonally modulated. And we didn't find any evidence for that, which I realize other people are looking for or have tried to look for, and some have found as well. So at least in our hands, the monkeys are not simulating the trajectory using a grid code when they see both options in simultaneously, but they seem to be doing that when they see one at a time. And I think then your question about whether it's actually doing the integration, the grid code, or not. I mean, the two relevant pieces of evidence we have are connected, but don't fully answer the question. And that's that, I mean, we know from our second experiment that the specific position in value space and the relationships in this value space are encoded via a grid. And that if we disrupt in MFC, and if we disrupt MFC, which hopefully disrupts this map, we can no longer rely on this integrated ability to evaluate an option or to assign value to it based on the product. But of course, it's still a slight leap of pace, because just because we disrupted MFC and MFC holds these grid representations, we cannot prove that we disrupted the grid representations and that that's necessarily what integrated it. I mean, this is how we interpret it at the moment, but it's going to be very hard to just disrupt the grid representation and not other things and other neurons in MFC to fully prove that point, I guess. I think the parallels with physical space that I'm kind of thinking of is that generally in physical space, you think of it as locations, and a location in our space is necessarily an integrated one. So where, you are wondering where in probability and magnitude space you are. So I think maybe the grid code is important for the actual integration, but we haven't got like a perfect proof for it at the moment. Does that answer all the different components? Have I forgotten something?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Matt, I have some question, but I don't know I can formulate well, because I feel like when I'm trying to ask the question, my brain is like a hypertransform or something like that, but I will try. So I'm trying to think about that actually, what make this generalizability actually. So I'm also trying to think about with the connection with the previous finding. I think it's based on the same data. So actually the replay study actually showed that when the rat is navigating the right side, they also think about the left side and the alternative side. But it means that maybe they can think about this as like a whole experiences as a together. Actually, so it means that the one hypothesis can be the generalizability maybe came from as a whole experiences, more the global experiences because they're sharing the temporal context. The another possibility may be because they're sharing the geometry kind of like more like spatial context is similar. I think that is one of the questions, maybe Olga in the Q&A. So I think that maybe it can be both also. In that case, if the second is, if it's really the spatial, do you think that when you're just recording the same space in the different time, and that can generalize better, something like that?
Yeah, so I really like sort of this way of thinking of saying, well, generalization here can be based on space or time, and we can imagine like specific experiments that would really dissociate them, right? Like if you enforced like a certain temporal schedule of when the routes gets experienced to, you know, which kind of arm of the maze and things like that. And I think, you know, right now, we obviously haven't done those experiments, but based on, I guess, you know, I think of like behavioral experiments of animals' ability to generalize in space and time. Like I would fully expect that, you know, the hippocampus is involved in both, that we wouldn't get some sort of dissociation there. So yeah, I guess it's really a spatial temporal context, and it's just in this particular experiment, we didn't explicitly manipulate time. Like the animals, you know, didn't have any clear bias of like which spatial trajectory they took in what time of the experiment. But like I mentioned, one thing that we can ask is just to verify, like, are these temporal sort of relationships between just time 1 and time 2, or more accurately, maybe trial 1 and trial 2 of the same experience, are those also preserved? And it looks like, again, we can do the same thing, like predict better than our various definitions of chance across subjects. So, you know, even though that's not, I didn't show you that data, but that does seem likely. I guess, where do we go from there? Like there must be some point at which that prediction breaks down. Like what are the limits? Like maybe similar to kind of, if I kind of integrate across some of the talks, like in some situations you do see grid codes, in some situations you don't. Like, is there something that maps onto whether or not you can have this cross-subject predictability with our approach that sort of defines, yeah, the limits or the scope of generalization? And yeah, like using both, I guess, spatial and temporal components to clarify that would be informative. And then I mean, you also mentioned replay, right? And I guess I also wondered, well, for generalization, say to novel trajectories in the same space, there's been this ongoing discussion in the rodent hippocampus literature on, you know, do you see pre-play or not? So the, you know, representation of unexplored space, to what extent does that happen? I guess there are some conflicting reports about it, but it would be fascinating to know, like, to the extent that it does happen, or the circumstances where it does. Again, does that require, I suppose, the grid code that would in principle be pretty well suited for that, right? Like, is there, again, some kind of parallel that we could make to situations where we see pre-play of not yet experienced trajectories and the existence of a cross-subject preserved structure? So yeah, I agree. It seems like because these things support each other or interact, like it would be important to test, like, to, yeah, what extent do they co-occur across different paradigms where there is or isn't behavioral generalization.
I think, Miriam, you just moved the question to the live, so you want to answer the question? I think it's from Erie, like, wait, where is it? I think I cannot find the question anymore. Yeah, or maybe it's just deleted. I cannot find it. Maybe I'll just.
I think I can see it. Okay. Thanks for the question, Ari. It's about whether the subjective weighting of probability and magnitude are reflected in the hexagonal modulation. It's a good question. So I guess we didn't design the task to distinguish between a potential objective and subjective code. So they are very highly correlated. We did use a subjective model, and we also sometimes try to look at the same without using a subjective model. So our final model did have like a softmax function, like a specific side bias, and this, you know, additive multiplicative weighing parameter, and a weighing of probabilities and magnitudes. Those were the 4 parameters in the winning model. We didn't have any that specifically distorted probabilities and magnitudes, because the model that didn't include those parameters did better on our data. But I guess your question is, when we use the subjective model versus we don't, does that change the grade code? And I mean, we find it in both cases, whether we use, you know, the objective product, like the sort of optimum policy or their subjective value. But we can't say that one is much better than the other. They're basically very highly correlated still. So the grid is there no matter what, but I can't tell you if it's explaining subjective, better explained by subjective value, or if it reflects the sort of distortions.
And also, there is a question before the Yunje, but I don't know where everything's go. But Matt, did you see the question maybe, or maybe there's another one from the Liu?
Yeah, I just typed an answer.
Okay, that's why. So okay, yeah. Did you also find this one like if you try to decoding the say the red 2R right from the concatenated population vector consisting of the red 2 left and red 1 left and the red 1 right, something like that. Yeah.
Oh, right. So I guess I have to think about how I would try to set that up. I guess the way I usually think about decoding, like, is in this very specific way where you have, tuning curves from one rat, and I'm not sure if I immediately see how I would use the tuning curves from another rat to do it, because I wouldn't know, whether neuron 5 in the first rat corresponds to neuron 1 or 20 or whatever in the second rat. And I guess that geometric alignment is what the hyperalignment problem solves. But I guess it could be a good control if I do random mappings for that or something. Like you're basically saying, using some other rat's tuning curves to decode position of the first rat, if I understand you correctly. And yeah, I think, yeah, it could be a useful control. But yeah, I think it wouldn't work unless you had some way of like mapping which tuning curve from one rat corresponds to one in the other. And yeah, but it could be useful. Thanks for the suggestion. I'll think about if that could be another source of predictions to compare to or to find out why things work. Yeah.
I have a question maybe for Miriam, but I think that if the Matt also have an opinion, maybe you can jump in. I don't know if there's answer too, but also, yeah. So do you think there's any differences with the internal grid code and the medial prefrontal grid code? Because that I also know that your lab is also very interesting about the anatomy. So another prong is actually the anatomical thing, right? So Jerome Saleh or maybe the Matthew Rochers might think about that. Is there any difference in the anatomical connectivity, and there's any potential difference role of these two grid code?
Okay, maybe I can start talking and Matt, you can jump in. So, I mean, starting with what we see in our data at least, we can't dissociate the two. In fact, the enteral one is quite weak, and that's maybe because the signal is easily weak and monkey data is noisy in sort of medial temporal lobe structures. But I think there isn't an experiment currently that dissociates the grids in enteral cortex and medial prefrontal cortex. I guess when you're asking about the connectivity, it is true that MMC is close to the regions on the orbital and medial surface of PFC that know about cognitive maps of task space, like work by Yaniv, Nico Shaw, Jeff Schoenbaum, etc. So in other words, it knows about latent unobservable states. And so I could imagine that maybe when we navigate and simulate new experiences in those kind of spaces, especially those that might not always be continuous, but which could be discrete, that might rely more heavily on the medial frontal cortex. And then something I think I hinted at earlier is MFC is well known for keeping track of our current task goal, of our current default strategy, so to speak. So I don't know if it will be more flexible to sort of remap to the task at hand, maybe, than entorhinal cortex, but it's all sort of speculation at this point. I mean, you would want to see it already in the data that is out there. I guess there is, data on using fMRI where you can look at both entorhinal cortex and medial frontal cortex in more abstract spaces, like, by zooming in social hierarchies and by Alexa with stretchy birds. And it doesn't look like medial frontal cortex is much more pronounced in those spaces than in, say, Christian Dollar's Nature paper in 2010. So all of them find entorhinal cortex and medial frontal cortex across the sort of board. So I don't think from the data, we have a good reason to believe that what I just said is true, but from their connectivity, you could speculate that it could go that way.
Matt, do you want to add something, or maybe through the connection with the striatum connection or something, maybe, or?
Yeah, I guess when I think about what people have found in rodent prefrontal cortex, in terms of spatial signals, I think what you tend to see, like there have been some reports of goal representations, like from Bruno Pousset's group, when you have animals navigating to sort of hidden goal locations in open space, like you get these cells that fire specifically in these goal locations. Like that's been, I think, maybe one of the more relevant things that I guess are directly in line with how a lot of people think about what the content of the PFC representation would be that's useful in spatial navigation settings. To my knowledge, nobody's really looked for grid patterns in rodent prefrontal work, although certainly, you know, the capability is there. It's just that the data sets that exist, I think, have just used very small environments so that you can really do it. But it would be fascinating to know if you actually record in rodent PFC and have a large enough environment so that you could test for grid cells. Like I think that absolutely should be done. But yeah, it just hasn't yet.
Cool, thank you both. So I think we should start wrapping up the session. It was a thank you to all of our speakers. This was a really great session. And I guess if you want to keep the conversation going or if you have more thoughts, you can, I'm going to put up a slide where we have our emails. So feel free to email us at the email addresses here. Yeah, anything else you want to say, Xiaoming?
Yeah, sorry, I just remained a very good question that I want to discuss in the last minute, but we didn't have a time to answer. But also we doesn't have a good answer actually. So we'll just keep what you posted in here. We'll keep it, and actually this GAN will, the CCN will be actually in the continue the next year. So if we have more evidence about your question, maybe we'll try to answer your question in the next year, or maybe you can just jump into our collaboration or your opinion in our paper kind of thing. It is very nice. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you very much to the organizers of this GAC for this great conversation and discussion. And again, as a reminder to everyone, this was the kickoff of the workshops of GACs, and the conversation and discussion will continue. So please, everyone, stay tuned. You can follow us on Twitter. You can also register to the CCN mailing list, and we will be making the announcements on how to get the engagement of all the community. So again, thank you to the organizers, and of course, thank you to all the attendees who made this also a great discussion. And with that, we finish all the 6 GACs of this year kickoff workshops of GACs, and we will continue also next year, but during this year, we will have more engagement as well. So thank you, everyone, and yeah, let's keep connected. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for organizing. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you for the great talks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Staying. We are still in the webinar, or we already done?
We are still live. Yeah.
Oh, we're still live? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. It was great. I just feel like that there's more time. It would be nice, but yeah, I think
we can. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know when it will be? This thing will be the publish, like when we can see the video or something?
Probably maybe a week or so. If there's no edits that you guys need, I don't think there's probably any edits. So we just process it, and we're going to set up a web page for our YouTube channel plus web links. So yeah,
I think there's a little the black moment when the Alison Banino have the slide problem. Maybe you can just cut that part, except that I think it's everything fine. But Linda will check about that. Everybody's happy with the having the video out actually. So
yeah,
Linda, we'll let you know.
Speakers are okay with.
Yeah, just check and let us know on the Slack, and then we'll take the go ahead once you do that.
Thank you, Linda. It was very.
Yeah, well, thank you.
We're done.